In September 2017, Americans learned something shocking. Their names, social security numbers, birth dates, and addresses had been exposed. Not because of a foreign invasion. Not because of a government failure. But because of a single company most people never chose to trust. This is the story of the largest identity breach in U.S. history. And how 147 million Americans lost control of their personal data, without ever opting in. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to understand what Equifax was. Equifax wasn't a bank. It wasn't a government agency. It was a credit reporting company. One of 3 companies that quietly tracked the financial lives of nearly every adult in the United States. You didn't sign up for Equifax. You didn't give it permission. But it had your data anyway. Your credit history. Your employment records. Your identifying information. All stored in massive databases. And in 2017, those databases were breached. The attack itself wasn't sophisticated. There was no zero-day exploit. No advanced cyber weapon. The hackers exploited a known vulnerability in a web application Equifax was using. A vulnerability that had already been publicly disclosed. And already had a patch available. That patch was never applied. For weeks, attackers had unrestricted access. They moved through systems quietly. Extracting data. Copying files. Leaving almost no trace. By the time Equifax discovered the intrusion, the damage was already done. The attackers had accessed the personal information of approximately 147 million people. That was nearly half the population of the United States. The data stolen included social security numbers. Once exposed, a social security number can't be changed. It's permanent. Which meant this wasn't a temporary breach. It was a lifelong one. When Equifax finally announced the breach, the reaction was immediate. Public outrage. Congressional hearings. Executives called to testify. But the most unsettling part wasn't how the breach happened. It was how unavoidable it was. Every adult with a credit history was affected. Even people who had never interacted with Equifax directly. There was no way to opt out. No way to reclaim the data. And no way to undo the exposure. Equifax offered credit monitoring. But credit monitoring doesn't prevent identity theft. It only alerts you after something goes wrong. For millions of Americans, the damage wasn't theoretical. Fraudulent accounts were opened. Loans were taken out. Credit scores were damaged. And years later, many victims were still dealing with the consequences. The breach exposed more than data. It exposed a structural problem. A private company held some of the most sensitive information in the country. Yet it wasn't regulated like a bank. It wasn't protected like government infrastructure. And the people affected had no direct relationship with it. Trust was mandatory. Accountability was optional. Investigations later revealed deeper failures. Outdated systems. Weak internal controls. Security warnings ignored. Even more troubling, some company executives sold stock before the breach was publicly disclosed. Raising serious questions about insider knowledge. The fallout was massive. Equifax paid hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements and fines. Executives resigned. New cybersecurity rules were proposed. But for the people whose data was stolen, there was no real resolution. Once personal data is exposed at that scale, it never truly disappears. It gets copied. Resold. Archived. Long after headlines fade. The Equifax breach became a turning point. It showed how fragile America's data infrastructure really was. How a single unpatched vulnerability could expose nearly half a nation. And how ordinary people could suffer consequences from decisions they had no role in. No consent. No control. Today, years later, the breach is still cited as a warning. Not because it was the most advanced attack, but because it was preventable. A simple patch. A basic security failure. And yet the cost was permanent. The hack didn't just expose data. It exposed a reality. In modern America, your identity can be compromised by systems you never chose, and mistakes you never made. And once that happens, the consequences follow you for life. If you want more true stories about the biggest hacks in American history, subscribe to American Hack Files. And tell me in the comments, should companies that hold data this sensitive be allowed to exist without strict oversight? Or was the Equifax breach inevitable in a system built on invisible trust?